How to lie by telling the truth. I need to be honest with you. That sentence usually sounds like safety, like transparency, like moral high ground. But in therapy, that's often how the most sophisticated lies begin. Most people think lying means saying something false. But the most damaging lies are built entirely from truth. Facts. Timelines. Evidence. You can tell the truth and still completely betray someone's reality. Let me tell you how it usually sounds. I told her where I was. I told her who I was with. I told her what I was doing. Everything I said was technically true. What I didn't tell her was why I stayed. Why I didn't want to come home. Why her voice made me tired. Why being near her felt like pressure. I never said those things because she didn't ask. And because I knew that if I said them out loud, I wouldn't be able to see myself as a good person anymore. This is how lying by telling the truth works. You don't create a false story. You carefully edit a real one. You choose facts and hide meaning. You tell someone what happened, but you remove how it felt, what it meant, and what it changed. And then you watch them fill in the blanks. Not with suspicion, with trust. That's the part people don't talk about. When someone lies with false words, we feel confused. When someone lies with truth, we feel safe. Until we don't. Because the body always knows when something is missing. That quiet anxiety. That feeling of, I can't explain it, but something is off. That's not insecurity. That's perception. You can't argue with facts. But you also can't build emotional safety on information alone. Truth without emotional presence is not honesty. It's control. And the person telling the truth often doesn't see themselves as manipulative. They see themselves as careful, polite, not wanting to hurt anyone. But what they're really doing is protecting their self-image. At the cost of the other person's reality. This is why the most dangerous lie doesn't sound like deception. Sounds like sincerity. And that's where the real damage begins. Most people who lie by telling the truth don't feel dishonest. They feel reasonable, measured, even ethical. Because in their mind, honesty means not saying anything false. And they didn't. They told the facts. They just controlled the meaning. This is not a communication problem. It's a psychological defense. When someone shares only what is safe, neutral, and defensible, they are not trying to deceive. They are trying to stay in control of how they are seen. If I tell you everything that happened but not how I felt, you can't accuse me of intention. If I tell you where I was but not why I didn't want to come back, I remain innocent. Truth becomes a shield. This pattern often starts early in life. In families where emotions were overwhelming, ignored, or punished, facts became safer than feelings. You learned that explaining was acceptable, but feeling was risky. So you adapted. You became clear, logical, articulate. You learned how to sound honest without being exposed. And it worked. People trusted you, respected you, saw you as stable. But intimacy requires more than accuracy. It requires vulnerability. And vulnerability feels dangerous to someone who learned that emotions create consequences. So instead of lying, you edited. You left out the parts that could create conflict, disappointment, rejection. Not because you wanted to hurt anyone, but because you didn't feel safe enough to be fully seen. This is why people who lie by telling the truth are often genuinely confused when relationships break down. They say, "But I never lied." And factually they're right. But emotionally they were absent. The other person didn't lose trust because of a lie. They lost trust because of inconsistency. The words made sense. The behavior made sense, but the emotional connection didn't. And the nervous system notices that gap. That's why being around someone like this feels strangely lonely. You have information, but not access. Clarity, but not closeness. Over time, this creates self-doubt in the other person. They start questioning their intuition. They wonder if they're too sensitive, too demanding, too much. But the problem was never the amount of truth. It was the absence of emotional presence. Honesty is not about disclosure. It's about alignment between what you say, what you feel, and how the other person experiences you. When those three don't match, truth becomes distortion. And the most painful part is that no one can point to a clear lie. Just a quiet sense that something is missing. And that absence does real damage. Because humans don't bond through facts. They bond through shared emotional reality. If you want, next we can go into the moment where this pattern collapses. The moment when telling the truth is no longer enough. And the person has to choose between protecting their image or creating real intimacy. There comes a moment when this strategy stops working. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. It happens when the other person stops asking questions. Not because they understand, but because they're tired. They sense that every answer will be correct, logical, and incomplete. So they stop reaching. This is usually the moment when the person who tells the truth starts feeling misunderstood. They say, "I don't know what else they want from me. I already explained everything." But explanation is not connection. And information is not intimacy. What the other person was asking for was never more facts. They were asking for access to your inner world, to your uncertainty, to your emotional risk. But instead they received clarity without closeness. And over time that feels like being alone together. This is when roles reverse. The person who edited the truth starts feeling abandoned. And the person who felt abandoned starts feeling free. Because once you stop expecting emotional presence, the confusion ends. And clarity returns. This is the cost of lying by telling the truth. You stay innocent, but you lose intimacy. And the loss is invisible. There's no argument. No betrayal to point at. No clear reason to stay angry. Just distance. This is why people who use this pattern often end relationships saying, "We just grew apart." But growth requires movement together. And distance grows where presence is avoided. The truth is, real honesty is uncomfortable. It risks being seen as selfish, inconsistent, uncertain. It means saying things like, "I don't know why I feel this way," or "Part of me wants to stay and part of me wants to disappear." These are not clean truths. They don't protect your image, but they create safety because they allow the other person to stand on the same emotional ground. Honesty is not about being right. It's about being real. And being real means letting go of control. This is the part many people avoid, because control once kept them safe. But what once protected you can later isolate you. If you recognize yourself in this pattern, this is not a judgment. It's an invitation to notice where truth became a performance, where clarity replaced courage, and where being good became more important than being present. Because the opposite of lying is not truth. It's connection. And connection begins the moment you stop editing yourself. There is a reason this pattern feels so hard to change. Because it once saved you. At some point in your life, telling the full truth was not safe. Not because you were dishonest, but because your emotions were inconvenient, too much, or simply unwanted. So you learned to survive through precision. You learned how to speak in a way that couldn't be used against you. You learned that facts kept you protected, and silence kept you acceptable. This is why letting go of this pattern can feel like danger. Not emotional danger. Identity danger. If I stop editing myself, who am I? If I let someone see my uncertainty, will they stay? This is the fear underneath controlled honesty. Not fear of hurting others. Fear of being rejected for who you really are. That's why many people confuse emotional honesty with emotional chaos. They imagine that being real means being overwhelming. But emotional honesty is not dumping. It's orientation. It's letting the other person know where you actually stand inside, even if that place is unclear. Especially if that place is unclear. Because uncertainty shared creates closeness, while certainty performed creates distance. This is the difference between being correct and being present. You don't need to reveal everything. You don't need to explain every feeling. But you do need to stop pretending that facts are enough. Connection happens when someone feels you are with them, not managing them, not protecting yourself from them, but meeting them. This doesn't mean you become reckless with your truth. It means you become relational. You start asking yourself a different question. Not, is this technically true? But, if I don't say this, what reality am I creating for the other person? Because every omission shapes a story, and that story has consequences. Emotional honesty is not about confession. It's about responsibility. Responsibility for the emotional impact of your clarity. This is how truth stops being a shield and becomes a bridge. Not perfect, not clean, but human, and safe enough to stay. If this resonates, take a moment. Notice where you are still editing yourself. Not to judge it, but to understand what it's protecting. Because what once protected you deserves respect. But it may no longer deserve control over your relationships. Connection begins when protection softens, and presence takes its place. At some point, everyone who lives this way reaches a quiet edge. Not a crisis, not a breakdown, a moment of clarity. It usually sounds like this inside. I'm doing everything right. So why do I still feel alone? This is the moment where the old strategy stops giving relief. Because the problem was never honesty. It was distance. Distance created by protection, by careful wording, by staying emotionally unreachable while appearing open. You can live like this for a long time. You can be admired, trusted, seen as mature. But something essential will always feel missing. Because relationships don't deepen through